This is Jeffrey Tucker, the Brownstone Institute. It's my pleasure to be here with one of the greatest living economists, as far as I'm concerned, David Stockman. Long history of writing the books that he's not supposed to write. And, and it's happened again.
Yes.
He has written a book called Trump's War on Capitalism, which I reviewed and said that it's the most truth-telling book of the Trump era. But it, of course, is not a welcome product any more than his takedown of the Reagan administration was after Reagan's first term, or anything else he's written. But he ends up writing classics, and my own view is that this is a classic because it really does get to the nitty gritty of what actually happened in every area of policy in those 4 years. Even though I suppose it's not been greeted with a great deal of excitement. Am I right, David?
I think that's right. I wrote it because I really think Republican voters, MAGA faithful, conservatives needed a wake-up call that Donald Trump proved in his 4 years and what he said since, that he's not who he claims to be. He's not remotely a conservative, an economic conservative. He has no clue as to how to drain the swamp, and surely it needs draining. And, all the boasting about the great MAGA economy, the best economy ever, is just absolutely wrong, unsupported by the facts. So in the book, we dig into all of those things and basically lay out the case that we don't want Donald Trump back in the Oval Office for another 4 years if we're concerned about a national debt that's exploding, if we're concerned about a Federal Reserve that, printed so much money that it practically drowned the economy in speculation and inflation, if we're concerned about what happened in the spring of 2020. When basically Trump presided over an absolute totalitarian maneuver to shut down the economy, destroy property, take away people's fundamental rights, based on some very bad information about the pandemic. And that could have been easily debated and refuted at the time and was, but he didn't listen because basically, as I say in the book, I think Trump at the end of the day is not right or left, liberal, conservative. He's a Caesarian. He's for power as long as he's exercising the power. I think he's kind of a, quasi-statist who pursues whatever whim seems to strike his fancy at the moment. But you have to look at the record, and there are a lot of different aspects of it, and we can go into it. But I think the bottom line about whether government is getting smaller or bigger, which is really the ultimate litmus test, is where's the public debt? And here's a number that's startling. It took 216 years, 43 presidents to get the first $8 trillion of public debt in the United States. That happened as of 2005. Trump came into office with 20 trillion of public debt. It was 28 trillion rounded when he left. So he replicated in 4 years what it had taken 43 presidents and 216 years to accomplish in the first place. And that's just, a kind of startling statistic, but it encapsulates how far things drifted in the wrong direction. Certainly nothing to do with even remotely conservative economic policies.
It's a remarkable thing because there used to be a sort of a standard that people would use, like how much was spent under certain presidents, and you would see it allocated. Nixon, Carter, Reagan, and so on and so on. And the perception that was always given out by the Republicans was that the Democrats were fiscally irresponsible, but the Republicans were budget balancers, limiting government, reducing the amount of debt, and so on. At least that's the public perception. And yet that narrative seems to have, completely vanished because, am I right that under that standard,
Yeah.
Trump is possibly the worst performing president since, I don't know, FDR, Wilson? I'm not.
Yeah, he isn't trumpeting what he did about government spending because it's not anything to brag about. And I lay that out. I've looked at every presidential term, including, Nixon Ford together because it was the continuous policy, Kennedy Johnson. But if you look at everybody back to Truman, the growth rate in constant dollars of government spending, interest, Social Security, defense, the whole ball of wax, averaged 2.5% per year. And that, that was a little more than the growth of the economy, and that's why government got bigger. During Trump, it averaged 7% per annum. In other words, it was pushing 3 times the norm. And, we had all of this rhetoric going into 2016 about the terrible big spending Obama years. And they were pretty bad. But spending growth during the Obama 8 years was about 5%. So Trump beat that. Reagan didn't slow down government spending that much either because defense, exploded during that period. Domestic spending was slowed down a little bit. But his average growth rate during the 8 years was 3.5%. So no matter who you compare it to, I mean, if you compare it to Bill Clinton, it was really bad. It was 1%. You compare it to Jimmy Carter, 2%. Yeah. We don't need to dwell in these statistics, except the record is so crystal clear on this and many other metrics that it's amazing that there isn't even a Republican primary going on. Oh, there is kind of the last gasp of the neocon establishment with Nikki Haley, but not really. And so the Republican Party is about ready to draft for a second run in the Oval Office, the nemesis of everything more or less Republican politicians have campaigned on for decades and decades, going back to FDR.
Can I ask, because I want to get to 2020, but can I ask about the first 3 years in isolation from, the COVID response? How does Trump spending in those 3 years before the great disaster of 2020 happened?
Well, that's a great question, and surprisingly, it was more of the same that we've been talking about. In other words, you have to look at spending not only in the absolute sense, but also in context. What was the business cycle doing? Were we at the top of a boom heading down? Were we at the bottom of a bad recession trying to dig our way out? You have to put that in context. Now, the context is that Trump came into office in January 2017 when this prolonged recovery from the Great Recession was finally getting up a pretty decent head of steam. The crisis was well in the rearview mirror. Most of the emergency spending had disappeared. So the logical thing that even Keynesians have been saying for decades and decades was when the economy is in the sweet spot of the cycle, mid-cycle to, the top of an expansion, that's the time for fiscal consolidation, as they call it. That's the time to begin, to bring the budget into balance or even run small surpluses to offset what they consider to be the necessary large deficits during a downturn. What did Trump do? Well, he inherited a deficit, the last Obama budget, of about $500 billion. And Obama was doing, in some, half-hearted way, what the Keynesian said. His peak deficit was $1.5 trillion. That was in 2009. And he got it down to $500 billion. So he was working his way towards, what the conventional policy standard was. Trump got in, and in 3 years, before anybody even knew the word COVID, before any of the lockdown business or shutdown of the economy happened, he had the deficit back up to $1 trillion a year. In other words, he marched it back uphill in a totally contra-cyclical manner. I don't buy all this cyclical, fiscal policy, but even if you do, which is what mainstream economists believe and what Washington believes, he did the opposite of what was expected. And of course, that was because of the big tax cut, that wasn't paid for during 2017, which became effective in 2018 and 2019.
There wasn't any sense in all those years, as I recall, of fiscal restraint. It wasn't even part of the public conversation, and certainly Trump never seemed to care much about it. Can I ask you to speculate on a possible reason? I mean, in his own business career, leverage was the way he built everything, right? As a real estate developer, and you'd always get from the bank, whatever you could, right? I mean, basically trading reputation, not just future returns, but exaggerated future returns. I mean, whatever the bank's willing to lend you, you always take. So you put that same mentality in the White House, where you've got a Congress ready to spend money and a Federal Reserve that's willing to buy any and all debt that the Treasury creates. Do you think that just created a kind of a weirdly toxic mix?
Yeah, exactly. In fact, there's a classic moment. I think it was sometime during 2018 when Powell was belatedly trying to what they called normalize policy, because we had gone for like 6 or 7 years at that point with the federal funds rate at practically zero, and he was trying to bring it back in the direction of normalcy. And he was being constantly attacked by Trump, who said, we're the greatest economy in the world, and we should be having interest rates that are the lowest in the world. And by that, I mean zero. And so that with zero interest rates, his contribution to fiscal consolidation was to get interest rates down to zero, so it wouldn't cost anything to carry this, ballooning public debt that was happening on his watch. So, the thing is, it sounds a little, insane almost. But I think you have to recognize that Trump, doesn't reason in a way that's informed by what, policymakers with any kind of experience know, regardless of what side of any debate or policy issue they're on. He doesn't know things. He just pulls, he pulls it out of his hat, and you get all kinds of really crazy stuff, including the fact that we're entitled to have the lowest interest rates in the world because we're the best economy. In other words, to him, what's right is what's on top. What's right is what's winning, whether it makes any sense or not. And that's why his economics are so dangerous. And now, we're 4 years later. He skipped a term, obviously, for all the reasons we could go into. But we have a serious, red-hot fiscal crisis on our hands. Interest rates are now normalizing back in the 4 to 5% range. When you put that, it takes a while to work its way through the federal debt. Some of it's 30 years, 10 years, 5 years. But eventually, we're going to have a weighted average cost of debt around 4 to 5%. It was less than 2% during Trump's term. And when you have interest rates, let's just round to make the math easy, at 5%, and you have CBO now in their latest forecast telling us by the mid-30s, the 10-year horizon, we're going to have a public debt of $60 trillion. So do the math. That's $3 trillion of interest payments. Now, the reason that I think it's important is that when Trump was celebrating the greatest economy ever, as this fiscal situation was getting out of hand, interest on the federal debt was $300 billion. In other words, we're on a trajectory where interest on the debt, and not in the by and by, but in a period of time that we can actually see and measure, will be 10 times greater, 3 trillion, not 300 billion. And when you get interest expense that high, defense is $1 trillion. That's a lot. Social Security is 1.3 trillion. That's a lot. Medicare is 800 billion. That's a lot. We're talking 3 trillion. Just for interest expense, paying the dead hand of the past. Now, therefore, we're going to run into a crisis where policy has to change. And I point out some of this in the book, but again, a good take on the math, the fiscal math, which it kind of is important to grasp, is that if you look out over the horizon, 5 years, 10 years, spending seems to be stabilizing with the warfare state, the welfare state, and all the pork barrel in between at about 25% of GDP. That's basically what's in the latest CBO forecast if you take out some of the flim-flam in there that isn't going to happen. Revenue is stabilizing at about 17% of GDP. If you extend the Trump tax cuts, which Washington will probably do, because nobody wants to see a fiscal cliff, and next year everybody's taxes are higher. So if you extend the Trump tax cuts at 17% on the revenue side, 25% on the spending side, that's an 8% of GDP structural deficit in a period in which even the Keynesian economists at CBO suggest that the best we can expect is 4% per year growth over time in nominal GDP. Now, it doesn't take a lot of, a PhD in economics to understand that if your deficit is 8% and your economy is growing at 4%, you're going to bury yourself in interest payments and in pretty short order. That's the fundamental time bomb that sits right in front of this election and the choice of the next president. And Trump is probably, among the choices available, the absolute worst guy to have in the captain's chair as this issue presents itself, because he said, no Social Security, we're not touching it. Medicare, we're not touching it. I need a big stick for defense. I want my $1 trillion so that, I can browbeat the rest of the world into doing what I think is needed. And obviously, he's not going to buck the Republicans on raising taxes if it were a good idea, which it's not. But if you have no taxes, no welfare reform, and no warfare state curtailment, you're just drifting into a pretty serious calamity.
And then more browbeating of the Federal Reserve, which became a routine during the Trump administration. I don't, tell me if I'm right about this, I don't recall ever a president that was so aggressive in publicly chiding the Federal Reserve on instructing them on what they should do. I know that sometimes this happened under Nixon and I don't know, variously, but Trump is, am I remembering right? He was very aggressive telling the Federal Reserve, what to do.
Absolutely. Probably the most famous incident before Trump was when LBJ called William McChesney Martin down to the ranch and allegedly, and there's some photos around, pinned him up against a wall in one of the stables and said, my boys are dying in Southeast Asia and you better print the money because you don't want to be responsible. You don't want blood on your hands, something like that. Now, but that was done in private. Okay. Right. Trump essentially tried to pin the Fed chairman up against the wall in public. And time after time. Really, if you get to the heart of our economic issues in this country, it boils down to three issues: the Fed, and the Fed. We've got a rogue central bank. All the problems start at the central bank. We have too little investment, too much speculation. That's central bank manipulation of interest rates and asset prices. We have, a government that is totally heedless when it comes to the public finances that we've been talking about. Again, the Fed monetized so much of the debt and kept interest rates so artificially low that in some ways, you can't blame the politicians for trying to get away with what the Fed enabled. And this is very different. I like to point out, and it's going to change, but it's very different than what we had in the early 80s. In the early 80s, Volcker was chairman of the Fed. He was not about to monetize big debts that were being created, by Congress and by the White House. And everyone knew, therefore, that you would get what was called crowding out. There's only so much savings supply down in those bond pits. And if the Treasury is in there absorbing all of it, you're going to drive up interest rates, and hometown businesses are going to be badly impacted. They're going to respond with nasty letters to their senators and congressmen, and you get a feedback loop. Now, the real bad thing about this massive monetization of the debt, public debt, the Fed has been doing, is not just that it's bad economics. We know that's bad enough. It's basically funding government spending with fiat money grabbed out of thin air. But what's really bad is that it breaks down the feedback mechanism in the fiscal governance process. They didn't hear from anybody back home. Let me tell you, in 1981 and 82, those congressmen and senators were hearing from people back home about 16% interest rates. But in the last few years, with the Fed monetizing everything, rates have been hideously low. I mean, hideously. They got down at one point during the Trump's term, so in a way you can't blame him for thinking that low interest is the elixir of economic life. The 10-year got down to 1.3%. I mean, that is crazy as hell when inflation has averaged 2 to 3% as far back as you can see. So you have to.
You're basically borrowing at 10 years at negative.
Yeah. In fact, I have a little. Now that we're on that topic, I have a little chart in the book that shows that the real rate, and what I do is subtract the 1-year inflation rate from the yield on the 10-year. The 10-year government note is the benchmark for the entire financial system of the world. It is the signaling system at the center of the financial apparatus. And it was basically telling people that long-term money is free. In fact, it has negative real cost. So now, in that environment, again, let me go back to this point about normalization. How did Trump do before the COVID? If you want to let him off the hook on that, which I know we're not going to, but the point about 2017, 2018, 2019 was normalization, not just a fiscal policy and bringing these large recessionary deficits under control, but what really had to normalize was monetary policy, the Fed. They had to stop buying massive amounts of new debt every month, which they were doing, and they had to get the interest rates up off the floorboard. Yep. And so the worst thing that a president could do in terms of policy during that period was to harass and hammer the Fed for trying in a very tepid, hesitating, delayed manner to normalize its balance sheet, which it was trying to do with QT and interest rates. So that's a real double negative against Trump. He borrowed like crazy, and he wanted to print money at the worst time in the cycle imaginable.
At what point did this quantitative tightening began? I recall that. Am I right in thinking that for sure sometime in the summer and fall of 2019, there were attempts at rate increases?
There were rate increases, but before that, they were actually into quantitative tightening, which I believe started in the fall of 2017 at a very low rate. They were letting, and they weren't really selling down their portfolio, which at that point was 4.5 trillion, their balance sheet, but they were letting maturing treasury debt and GSE paper roll off. And so from the time they started quantitative tightening, the debt was reduced. I mean, the Treasury's the Fed's balance sheet was reduced by about $700 billion. It went from $4.5 trillion to roughly $3.8 trillion. Then in the fall of 2019, we had this big crisis allegedly in the repo market. Right. Powell lost his nerve, and they decided that they didn't want to risk the Treasury market, the Treasury debt market, the most important financial asset market in the world. They didn't want to risk it finding its own natural market level. So they stepped in, they stopped quantitative tightening. And then, of course, COVID came a few months later, and, it was off to the races in March 2020 when they went back to $120 billion a month of quantitative easing or buying in the debt.
Yeah, and the idea that inflation was going to come was a no-brainer. Looking back at it now, although
it was transient, they said it was transient until all of a sudden it wasn't, and
Yeah, I mean, Bernanke got away with it, but through various tricks, but it didn't work.
But Jeffrey, if I could add here, I think the key thing is the Fed shot its wad, if you want to use that kind of metaphor. They can't go back to aggressive quantitative easing the next time as the economy stumbles or as interest rates begin to weigh more heavily on short-term economic activity, because they still don't have inflation under control. And they've made a big thing. They've made like the holy grail out of 2.0% inflation. I think that's nuts. Inflation should be zero. We shouldn't be destroying people's wealth through the back door of, inflation. But they can't even get to 2%. It's kind of stabilizing in the 3 to 4% range if you believe the BLS. But if you take out all the manipulation that goes on in the in the back room there, it's even higher. So they're in a position now where the market is demanding a new round of rate cuts, and they're unable to deliver it. I don't think they're going to for
fear of igniting a second round.
Yeah, because
that could actually be worse.
The one thing somebody gave Powell a historical lesson, because that's what happened in the 70s. Inflation got out of control in the early 70s. They tightened. We got a big recession, 74, 75. Carter came in. He put this, industrialists in charge of the Fed. The next thing you knew, inflation was back off to the races in double digits. And that lesson is pretty well understood in the Eccles building. They don't want to, be the next William Miller, Yeah,
but David, the part of the problem here is that, I mean, if you're right about Powell, that he was intending to kind of normalize things, he definitely acquiesced in the middle of March 2020 and threw in the towel. And I assume that somebody came to him and said, look, we know what you're trying to do here with your balance sheet, but that's not going to work for us for now because we've got a bad visitor from China, right? And and I'm sure you've reconstructed these days, but it seemed as if the way it unfolded was that the national emergency and everything, was deployed on March 13th, and then we got the famous lockdown, everything press conference on March 16th.
Yeah.
But it seemed like the Fed was actually moving with very dramatic stuff, on the 10th, 11th, and 12th of March. So they were already ready to go.
Well, yeah, they were actually in a reversal mode already from the crisis in September 2019, the repo crisis. So they had more or less thrown in the towel in terms of completing the normalization process. Remember, if you go back, this is all important history to understand, I think. at the time, Bernanke said back in 2011, 2012, when Powell was just joined the board and started to ask some inconvenient questions, he said, we mean to normalize. We're going to be careful about it. But this 4 trillion plus balance sheet that we've created, and the balance sheet was 900 billion before they, we went into the financial crisis. We're going to get it back dramatically lower than where it is at the moment. But what happened? They threw in the towel at 3.8 trillion. I mean, it was already 3 times bigger than it had been before the crisis. So as a result of that, the economy was already in a fragile condition. And I think the important point about all of this is to ask yourself, if the Fed hadn't been in this mode of stepping in and essentially funding the massive flow of new Treasury debt that was coming, what would have happened instead? In other words, remember, we talk about during that same 11-day period from, 2 weeks to flatten the curve, the press conference, in 11 days, they put together an 800-page bill that authorized 2.3 trillion of spending, or about half the size of the federal budget, sight unseen. Nobody had read it. There was typos. There were errors all over the bill. Now, in an environment where that was happening, and the bond pits were looking at that, and there was no cavalry coming from the Federal Reserve to buy up all that paper, where do you think interest rates would have gone? They would have soared, and there would have been a signal right then and there. You're taking this economy into a crisis unless you rethink what you're doing here. One, with the lockdowns. Now, that's our second point in the book. How did Trump get away with the lockdowns when supposedly he's the leader of the, free market party? Well, the answer is a few days after the press conference that you've just mentioned, he put out some tweets, and I've quoted them in the book, saying, "Don't worry, help is on the way. We're sending money. It's not your fault. The Chinese, they did it in Beijing, and they just flooded the market with money, flooded the economy with money, the stimulus checks, the 600 a week unemployment topper on top of what people were getting in the regular state program, and all the other handouts to education institutions, health institutions. You can go on and on. Indian tribes, the veterans, everybody got money. And this flood is basically wouldn't have happened if you had an honest central bank. Couldn't have happened. You would have had the bond vigilantes, marching on the Capitol, so to speak. None of that disaster that came from the combination of lockdowns and then 6 trillion of stimulus spending in 3 tranches over the next 12 months. None of that would have happened. It all happened on Trump's watch. And so, you have to go back to what I call the Harry Truman standard. He had that plaque on his desk, the Truman Doctrine, but not the one about containing the Soviet Union, but the Truman Doctrine that said the buck stops here. Right. And the buck stops with Trump. He authorized the lockdowns. He listened to Fauci and Dr. Birx and all the rest of them. He signed all the bills. He campaigned in the fall of 2020 on another 2,000 stimmy check on top of the first ones that had gone out. So, the record is pretty clear, and the accountability, unfortunately, has been lost to the Republican Party. Yes. And that's one of the great.
It's very strange. It leaves basically you as the only person talking about the actual reality, which by the way was also true in the 1980s. So I'm not. This is not exactly unprecedented. But does it frustrate you that there's been basically no accountability? Like Trump has never really asked any questions about these policies and about the consequences, about his connection to the COVID lockdown, certainly, but even the fiscal problem that developed before that, for that matter, the failure of his trade policy, that there's really been zero real serious public inquiries about this.
Yeah, that's true. And of course, Trump's modus operandi is, as I say in the book, he slides by the seat of his ample breeches, and he makes up things as he goes along based on whoever talked to him last or some notion that he got somewhere in the middle of the night prowling around the White House or whatever he was doing. And so it's unpredictable. At least Biden is somewhat predictable. He's wrong on almost everything, but you know what kind of playbook he's reading off from. Trump's, sui generis, who knows what it is. And in the environment we're in, you need a very specific playbook, which is based on sound economic and financial principles. And there's no chance that he's going to bring that to the party.
Well, it puts your book in a strange position, really, and I'm really grateful for it. And I think I'm not sure if I encouraged you to write it, but I was.
You did, and I appreciate that. Yeah, my fault. The one thing that we do in the book Trump's people, the MAGA partisans, let's call it that, want to justify all this. I've been on any number of interviews on the book, and it's always, but until February 2020, it was going gangbusters.
Yeah, that's what they would say, right? Mm-hmm.
I looked at it. It wasn't, number one. The job growth rate was, half of what it had been during Obama, even through February 2020, and it's the same business cycle recovery. Economic growth had averaged, way under 2%, and that isn't anything to write home about. I'm not saying the economy pre the shutdown, the lockdowns, was a disaster. What I'm trying to lay out here is that it wasn't the greatest economy in the history of the world. And so therefore, the justification that you hear from so many well-intended Republicans or conservatives is, there's a lot of things about him we don't like, and he was a terrible spender, and they might even understand he was wrong on the Fed and the lockdowns and everything else, but he delivered a great economy. He delivered it just wasn't. What he delivered was the tail end of a giant stock market bubble that was the result of this fantastic money printing from September 2008 through when they finally stopped in 2017. That's what he delivered. But that
dating back to 2000, really, I guess, is when the quantitative easing began, right?
But it really got bad, obviously, on the eve of the Lehman, meltdown. This is September 2008. The Fed's balance sheet was $900 billion. Now, the Fed at that point was 76 years old. It had taken them, 3/4 of a century to get to $900 billion. Within 3 months, Bernanke had doubled it. And within 2 or 3 years, the balance sheet was $4.5 trillion rather than 900. Now, people might say, well, what's so significant about balance sheet? Why do you harp on that? The answer is the balance sheet of the Fed is simply the record of how much money it's printed. That's how it prints money. It goes into the bond pits and, tells dealers we're buying $10 billion today, and puts it on his balance sheet, and it pays for it with, credits that are grabbed out of thin air. So when the Fed is expanding its balance sheet rapidly, it's just a measure of how much artificial credit or money, however you want to term it, is being pumped into the economy. And, it was huge.
There must have been, let me ask you, because you're very insightful on these things. Just 2 questions. Did you anticipate the resulting inflation? Why? And did you expect it to last as long as it has?
Well, ultimately, I think the one of the few things on monetary policy that Milton Friedman was right about. He was right on free enterprise and free markets and free trade and all that, but on money, he was kind of a closet Keynesian, I think. But the one thing he said is that inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon. Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true. But the problem is, what is the lag time between when you print the money and when you see the effects? How does it work when you have a open economy, not a closed economy? We're totally integrated into $100 trillion global GDP. So he didn't answer the question. He just laid down the principle. And so I buy the principle, but the world economy is so complicated today that the money printing, the excess monetary infusion, it works its way through a very complex, elaborate, opaque global financial system and economy, and it takes a while for effects to be registered, much different than maybe it was 40 or 50 years ago when our economy was closed. Now, one of the things all this money printing did was allow inflation to remain at a residual 2 to 3% level at a time when the Chinese economy was coming out of the starting blocks with very low costs. And as a result of that, we should have had zero inflation target, not 2%, or even maybe a disinflation target. But as a result of what the Fed was doing, unit labor costs soared during the 1990s and the 2010s and the 2020s. And that pushed production offshore into China, into Mexico, into Vietnam, and elsewhere. And so in the short run, that contained measured inflation, but it was just moving it around the system because the Chinese were buying up all this paper that the Fed was printing, and sooner or later the system reached a shock point. And the shock was obviously the supply chain disruption.
Yeah, that is a fascinating.
It happened. In other words, the inflation was out there brewing, and then when they locked down everything, not only here but around the world, the supply chains got totally disrupted, and all the cheap goods that were keeping inflation artificially suppressed suddenly soared. You can see it in the numbers. Up through February 2020. Durable goods inflation had been deflation had been constant at 2 to 3% a year for several decades. And all of a sudden, the price of durable goods took off because the inventories were totally depleted and the supply chains were disrupted. And even the COVID policy contributed because they put all this money in the economy. People couldn't spend it at the restaurant or bar or movies or mall, so they ordered stuff from Amazon and blew up, the global supply chain and durable goods prices. So, it all works its way through. It's complicated, but it's there.
David, I tell you, just talking with you, and I'm sure our listeners are feeling the same way. It's just such a breath of fresh air. I feel like I could talk to you about this for hours because we're treated with so much propaganda from the left and the right, and hardly anybody actually talks about the actual facts of the ground. So I think we should come to the end of the interview, actually, and except to say that everybody should buy this book, and it should be on everybody's bookshelf, like without exception. But let me ask you something. First, just sort of two questions. Do you agree that between Russiagate and the Ukraine phone call impeachment, and then the sort of surreptitious little plot to cause Trump to pull the trigger on lockdowns and so on, that there was, in fact, a kind of, for lack of a better term, ruling class attack on his presidency? And if you do agree with that, why do you think that is?
I think it was. I do believe that attack happened. It's obvious that the whole RussiaGate thing was a hoax. You can go through the whole Mueller report and everything that associated with that. And even as time goes on, more and more stuff comes out. Every day we're learning how that was confected and by the Brennan and the CIA and the deep state operators. Why were they so against Trump? Well, because they could see he was a cowboy, unschooled in Beltway orthodoxy, and that he therefore might be unmanageable. And he said things during the campaign like NATO is obsolete. That was true. You can't say in Washington today that NATO is obsolete without someone accusing you of being even crazier than the anti-vaxxers. Okay. It is there's an orthodoxy that says, of course you don't question NATO. Well, of course you question NATO. Yeah. The Cold War ended in 1991. So my point was, Trump let loose of some sentiments during the campaign, ill-formed, not thought through, because he never studied anything, he never educated himself, but he had a few insights that were correct about the forever wars and NATO and our foreign policy generally, interventionism. And I think that's because Washington today, I call it the war capital of the world. Most of the people down there exist to engage in this great global drama of the U.S. hegemon trying to manage and control and run what is happening in the world. And now we're trying to keep the sea lanes open in the Red Sea. Who the hell cares about the Red Sea? It's not really affecting our national security. It's affecting the cost of Chinese goods going to Rotterdam in Europe. And, so the point is, Trump wasn't safe when it comes to some of the basic orthodoxies of what, we're calling now the uniparty ruling class in Washington, and that's why they went after him.
Interesting. I would like to explore a little bit more with you concerning China trade policy, but I think we should leave it there. Thank you for your incredibly insightful analysis of this, and also your just sort of irrepressible desire to say what's true.
Well,
that is a rare thing these days.
Yeah. Okay. You have to because it's especially if you're a person that's been around a while and has had some experience. Because I can remember actually what people thought in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And when you compare it to what they're saying today, the other day, just to cap this off, Biden gave the most insipid speech that if we don't fight the Russians and the Ukraine, the next time it'll be in Lithuania, and then it'll be in Berlin, and then it'll be in the Benelux and London. That's the domino theory that we all learned in the 1960s was totally wrong and led to the catastrophe of Vietnam. And even then, there was a communist power of some magnitude in the 1960s. There's no enemy today. The Russia's $2 trillion of GDP. We're $26 trillion. China depends utterly on exports to the U.S. They're not going to attack California. So the world is fundamentally different. There is no domino theory. This is totally ridiculous. And yet it's said with a straight face, so.
David Stockman, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.